Rain hit the window like gravel thrown by a fist. I remember the grip first, my own hand, closing so hard around my phone that the case cracked, a thin white line splitting the black plastic right down the middle. Then the whisper. Not mine. Hers. My daughter's voice, small and flattened by wind, coming through 11 seconds of shaky video my neighbor had just sent me. Grandpa says I have to stay outside until I stop crying. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Somewhere behind me, a kettle was starting to scream, and I let it. Because for the first time in 6 years, the part of me that used to move before thinking, the part I'd buried under spreadsheets in soccer practice and Sunday dinners, opened one eye. And it recognized the storm outside for exactly what it was. A test. My name is Rachel Doyle. I'm 34 years old, and 8 years ago I was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army Logistics and Personnel, 2 deployments and honorable discharge, and a spine full of habits nobody warns you will never fully switch off. When I came home, I didn't go back to a desk job, I built one. Doyle Freight Solutions started in my garage with a single leased box truck and $11,000 of separation pay. 6 years later, it billed $2.3 million a year, employed 19 people, and had a logo on the side of 14 trucks that I designed myself at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while my daughter, Emma, slept in the next room. Emma is 8. She has my husband David's laugh and my stubbornness, which David says is a dangerous combination. David is an ER nurse, steady in a way I've never had to be steady, and together we'd built a small, quiet, unremarkable life. A 3-bedroom house, a mortgage we could actually afford, and a rule we'd made together the day Emma was born. No one raises their hand to our daughter. No one raises their voice to break her. Not us. Not anyone. My parents, Harold and Diane, live 40 minutes away on a lake property my father bought with money I lent him. $60,000, interest-free 11 years ago, still not repaid. That loan matters. Everything that happened matters against the backdrop of that number because money in my family was never just money. It was leverage. And on the night I'm telling you about, my parents had my daughter for a weekend toughening up. A phrase my father had used my entire childhood. And they decided a Category 2 tropical storm was the perfect classroom. 3 days before the storm, I dropped Emma off at my parents' lake house for what was supposed to be a normal weekend. My mother, Diane, answered the door in a cream silk robe at 11 in the morning, a mimosa sweating in her hand, ice clinking against the glass like punctuation. She's going to be fine, my mother said before I'd even asked. Your father has plans for her. I remember the exact tone. Breezy. Rehearsed. The tone she used when she'd already decided something and wanted me gone before I could ask follow-up questions. Behind her in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of my father, Harold, laying out gear on the kitchen table. A rain slicker 2 sizes too big, a pair of old combat boots that used to be mine, and a whistle on a lanyard. Not toys. Equipment. Dad, I said. What exactly are the plans? He didn't even look up from the table. Building some backbone into that kid. You were soft until the army fixed you. I'm not waiting for the army. I laughed it off. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn. I laughed, because it sounded like one of his usual overblown jokes, the kind he'd made my whole life about coddled kids and participation trophies. I kissed Emma on the head, told her I loved her, told her to call if she needed anything, and I drove away. I didn't know that 48 hours later, a storm named Priscilla would make landfall 2 counties over, and that my father would decide his 8-year-old granddaughter needed to stand in it. Beat won the video. The first evidence came from my neighbor Carol, whose sister lives 2 doors down from my parents' lake house. Carol sent me the 11-second clip at 6:47 p.m. Emma, soaked to the bone, standing on the back lawn in the wind, gripping a fence post while my father stood under the porch overhang, dry, arms crossed, shouting something I couldn't fully make out over the wind except one phrase. Toughen up, soldier. I called the house immediately. My mother answered, breathless, laughing. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Harold's got her out there for 10 minutes. It's basically a sprinkler. I could hear the wind howling through the phone. 10 minutes doesn't sound like a sprinkler. Beat 2, the confrontation and the jargon. I drove the 40 minutes in 22, called David from the road, and told him to meet me there. When I arrived, Emma was inside, wrapped in a towel, teeth chattering, lips faintly blue. My father was toweling off his own hair, entirely unbothered. "You put an 8-year-old outside in a tropical storm," I said. "Calm. Flat. I didn't yell. I never yell. It's not tactical." My father straightened up like he was briefing a subordinate. "It's called stress inoculation training, Rachel. Controlled exposure to adverse conditions builds resilience thresholds. It's basic psychological conditioning. The military's used variants of it for decades. You'd know that if you'd actually listened during your own training instead of just surviving it." It was almost impressive how confidently he said it, like citing a field manual that didn't exist. I pretended to accept it. I nodded. I said, "Okay, Dad." And I took my daughter home, and I did not sleep that night. B3 the pattern. Over the next 10 days, I did what 6 years of running a logistics company had trained me to do better than the Army ever had. I built a paper trail. I called Emma's pediatrician and got a documented note about a mild upper respiratory infection that started 3 days after the storm. I pulled the Weather Service's records confirming sustained winds of 45 miles per hour and half an inch of rain in the 22 minutes Emma was outside. Not 10. And definitely not a sprinkler. I quietly asked Emma gentle, careful questions, the kind a trauma-informed counselor later told me were exactly right. And I learned this wasn't the first time. There had been a hose down in December to build cold tolerance. There had been a locked outside timeout in July for talking back. My daughter had been quietly telling herself for over a year that this was just what grandparents did. Beat 4. Overheard. The worst discovery came by accident. I'd driven back to my parents' house to pick up a booster seat Emma had left behind, and I heard them before I opened the door. My mother's voice, sharp with amusement, drifting through the screen. "She still thinks it's about resilience," my mother said. "Rachel's always been gullible that way. Give her a big word and she nods along." My father laughed. "She owes us 60 grand and she's never once said a word about it. Guilt's a wonderful leash, Diane. As long as she thinks she owes us, she'll let us do what we want with that kid." I stood on the porch, hand frozen on the screen door, and felt something in my chest go very, very still. Not rage. Something colder and more useful than rage. Beat 5, the real motive. It took one more week to understand the full shape of it. I got access, through a joint account my father had never bothered to close after I helped him with a refinance years earlier, to bank statements. My parents weren't just careless. They were broke. The lake house was 6 months behind on a home equity line. My father had been telling friends, and apparently my mother, that once Emma was properly disciplined and loyal, they'd ask me to formally co-sign a second loan using Emma's college fund, a fund I controlled, not them, as collateral leverage, banking on guilt and family obligation to make me say yes. The storm wasn't discipline. It was a rehearsal. They were testing how far they could push before I'd stop them, and calibrating exactly how much control they could still extract from a scared 8-year-old and a guilty daughter. Here's what 6 years in logistics and 2 deployments teach you that nothing else does. Never let the enemy know you've already won the argument in your head. So I decided to disappear. Not literally. Tactically. I stopped confronting them. I started calling my mother twice a week, voice soft, slightly rambling, the tone of a woman still confused and eager to be forgiven for overreacting about the storm. I let my shoulders drop when I saw them. I let my father interrupt me mid-sentence without correcting him. I wore the same faded cardigan to 3 visits in a row, the one my mother always said made me look tired and small, because I'd learned in the Army that people underestimate exactly what they expect to see. Internally, I was doing something else entirely. I told David, "They think guilt is a leash. I'm going to let them believe they're still holding it, right up until I show them the collar's been unlocked the whole time." I started calling my father Dad more, softer, almost pleading, at the end of every visit. I asked him humbly, almost embarrassingly, for advice on parenting. I let my mother believe I was too soft, too foolish, too desperate for their approval to ever really fight back. It worked exactly as I'd planned. 3 weeks in, I overheard my mother tell a friend on speakerphone, "Rachel's finally coming around. She knows her place." The bait was simple and it had two parts. Part 1. I accidentally mentioned to my father during one of my soft rambling calls that Emma's $40,000 college fund was sitting in an account I hadn't touched in years, and that I was thinking about consolidating it for simplicity, dangling exactly the kind of access he'd been circling for weeks. Part 2. I offered to host Thanksgiving. All of it. My parents, my sister Melissa and her husband, my father's business partner Gary who'd been quietly financing their lake house debt, everyone. Before the dinner I did three things. First, I had David install a small legal recording device in our own dining room, clearly disclosed to our home security system, which every guest agreed to when they walked through our front door. A sign on the entry table stating the home was monitored, standard in half the houses on our street. Second, I had my attorney, a woman named Priya Anand who'd handled our business contracts for years, draft a document. A full accounting of the $60,000 loan, the interest-free terms and a formal notarized statement removing my parents as any kind of contact or decision-making party on Emma's college fund. I had it printed, folded, and placed inside a manila envelope on the sideboard, visible but unremarkable. Third, I put my phone on the table during dinner, face down, buzzing on silent, streaming a live feed from the nanny cam in the hallway to David's phone in his pocket, so we'd both know exactly what was happening in every room at every moment. Then I waited. I set the table. I made my father's favorite stuffing. And underneath the tablecloth my phone buzzed once, twice, three times. Melissa arriving early. Gary arriving late, my mother texting me from the driveway. Don't embarrass us tonight. I typed back. Wouldn't dream of it. I meant every word. Dinner started fine. Too fine. My father made a toast about family resilience. My mother complimented my cardigan for once, calling it an improvement. Gary asked about the business, and I gave vague, humble answers, the soft-spoken Rachel they'd spent 3 weeks convincing themselves was real. Then my father, 3 glasses of wine in, turned to Emma. You know, he said, loud enough for the whole table. Your mother used to cry over nothing too. Then the army fixed her right up. Wouldn't hurt you to spend a little more time outside. Toughen that spine before you're 20. Emma went very still, the way she'd gone still since the storm. A stillness I recognized now as fear wearing the shape of good behavior. Harold, my mother added, smiling into her glass, tell them about the hose in December. She barely even flinched by the end. Gary laughed. Melissa's husband laughed. My sister didn't, but she didn't say anything either. I set down my fork. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I reached for the manila envelope on the sideboard and set it, unopened, in the center of the table, next to the stuffing. Dad, I said, you keep using the phrase stress inoculation. I looked it up. It's a real clinical term. It's also not what you did. Real stress inoculation is supervised, brief, consensual, and monitored by a trained clinician. What you did was leave an 8-year-old alone in 45-mile-an-hour winds for 22 minutes, and then lie to me on the phone and call it 10. The table went quiet. My father's jaw tightened. And Mom, I continued, my voice never rising above the volume you'd use to ask someone to pass the potatoes, I heard you on the porch 3 weeks ago. Guilt's a wonderful leash. I heard every word. My mother's mimosa flush face went white. So I want to be very clear tonight, in front of everyone at this table, about 3 facts. I opened the envelope and set the documents flat. Fact 1. The $60,000 loan I gave you 11 years ago is now, as of this notarized statement, forgiven in full, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I will not let a debt be the leash you use on my daughter ever again. I slid the second document forward. Fact 2. As of this morning, neither of you has any legal or informal access to Emma's college fund, her medical decisions, or unsupervised time with her. Effective immediately, per my attorney. Gary shifted in his seat. My father opened his mouth. I didn't let him speak. Fact 3. I picked up the small digital recorder I'd set discreetly beside the salt shaker 2 hours earlier, clearly in full view now, and pressed stop. This dinner has been recorded. As disclosed on the sign, every one of you passed on your way in tonight. I have 11 seconds of a video showing my daughter standing in a storm. I have pediatric records. I have National Weather Service data. And I have your own voices tonight, confirming the December incident on tape. I stood. I picked up the manila envelope's twin, the copy, and tore it once cleanly down the middle, the sound louder in that silent room than it had any right to be. That was my copy of an agreement I signed years ago promising I'd always defer to my parents on parenting. I wrote that when I was 22 and scared of you. I'm 34 now. I'm done deferring. Behind me, headlights swept across the front window. I'd called a family law advocate earlier that week, per my attorney's advice, to be present for a formal, calm welfare check conversation with Emma in a neutral setting. Not police, not handcuffs, just paperwork and a quiet officer at the door confirming a report had been filed and would be reviewed. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. This is absurd. This is family business. It stopped being family business, I said. The moment you decided a storm was a lesson plan. In the 6 weeks that followed, the consequences arrived the way consequences do when you've already built the case before you ever raised your voice, quietly and completely. Child Protective Services opened a formal welfare review based on the documented incident in pediatric records. My parents were issued a formal finding of neglect and required to complete a parenting safety course before any future supervised contact with Emma would even be considered. Gary, my father's business partner and the quiet financier behind the lake house debt, pulled his backing within the week, unwilling to be publicly associated with a documented child welfare finding. The lake house went up for sale 2 months later. My mother's social circle, the country club women she'd spent 30 years cultivating, heard the story within days, the way stories like that always travel. She stopped attending the Thursday bridge games. Nobody uninvited her. She simply stopped being invited. My father, who had spent his life citing rules and regulations to win arguments, discovered that the actual rules, CPS guidelines, custody law, the plain language of a notarized document, didn't bend to his tone of voice. Not everyone in that fallout deserved to fall. My father's part-time property caretaker, a quiet man named Wendell who'd worked the lake house grounds for 6 years and had 2 kids of his own, lost his job when the house went up for sale. I found him work with one of my own drivers within the week, no fanfare, no story attached to it, just a phone call and a start date. Some people get caught in a storm they didn't make. I wasn't going to let him drown in one that was never his. 8 weeks later, on a night with sideways rain that felt almost like the universe had a sense of humor, our doorbell rang. My father stood on the porch, soaked through, no umbrella, a duffel bag at his feet. The lake house had sold for less than the debt on it. My mother, he said, was staying with her sister. He had nowhere else. Rachel, he said, and his voice had none of its old certainty in it. It's freezing out here. Just for tonight. I stood in the doorway, warm light behind me, and I thought about an 8-year-old gripping a fence post in a storm exactly like this one, being told it would make her strong. You taught me a lesson once, I said, about what people can be made to endure, and what it does to them afterward. I learned it. I just didn't learn the version you meant to teach. I didn't shout. I never do. You can't come in, I said. Not tonight. Not until there's real documented change, a completed course, a caseworker's sign-off real time. I hope you get there. I mean that. But hope isn't the same as access. I closed the door. Gently. The latch clicked into place with a small, ordinary sound. David was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with the particular quiet he reserves for moments he knows I need to walk through myself. I crossed the room and let him fold me into him just for a second, just long enough. Proud of you, he said into my hair. I know, I said. And for the first time since the storm, I actually believed it too. Here's what I've learned. Love that has to threaten, guilt, or break someone down to make its point was never love to begin with. It was control wearing love's clothes. Real strength doesn't come from being hosed down, left in a storm, or shamed into silence. It comes from someone finally deciding to stop absorbing the damage and start documenting it. If someone in your life has ever used guilt, debt, Or tough love as a leash? I want to know. Have you ever had to go quiet and calculated before you could finally stand up to a parent, a boss, or someone who was supposed to protect you? Tell me in the comments. And if this story hit home, hit like, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs to hear that walking away calm can be the loudest thing you ever do.